Hello everyone, my name is Julia Doxat-Purser and I'm the European Evangelical Alliance socio-political representative. I'd like to give the first part of this talk on the global public square, religious freedom in an age of expanding pluralism. And I'm going to be doing a quick review of the kinds of religious freedom problems we find across Europe. Let's start with what I would call the more traditional problems that we see more in the East than in the West. And we'll start with the most serious. So there are still great control and suppression in eastern Ukraine and in Belarus. In those places, all the people suffer because of the governments that they have, but Christians get oppressed as well. So in eastern Ukraine, many churches have had to close, literature has been banned, a Christian university has been occupied. There are soldiers doing target practice in the classrooms. In Belarus, churches have also been closed. Here's a photograph of New Life Church in Minsk. The building was closed. They've continued to meet in a car park. Even that is now deemed to be illegal, and they are perhaps being threatened with prison for continuing to meet. In Turkey, it's not quite so severe, but there is pressure upon Christians. Foreign Christians have been expelled from the country for no justification other than just mixing with Turkish Christians. And this is causing problems for the church. We also have disregard, where churches are just forgotten. So in Albania last year, there was an earthquake and Ergest Bitti's church, which was within an apartment building, was destroyed along with the rest of the building. So the authorities said, okay, we'll bulldoze the whole building and we will rebuild. But the plans don't involve the church. The church has been forgotten. It just wasn't important enough. Disregard is seen also in places where sometimes evangelicals cannot bury their dead in the way that they would like to, because the cemeteries belong to another faith community and that's imposed upon them. And you also have the situation where smaller, perhaps newer, less well-known communities are classed by society and the government as a cult, as a sect, as therefore probably dangerous, which is unfair and limits religious freedom. It's just ignorance. We also have prejudice and intolerance, sometimes connected to so-called national identity. So anti-Semitism is growing across the European Union. The European Commission is very concerned. They've just published a new strategy to try to tackle violent attacks against people and against property. And there is Islamophobia. Political rhetoric and media coverage of Muslims sometimes seems to suggest that they are all terrorists, sexual predators, invaders. This is far, far from the truth, and it's far more about pleasing voters and readers than about reality. In the West, we have problems that are more connected to secularism. So religion is just not that important. Now, during the pandemic, all religious communities have had restrictions placed upon them by the government, and most of these have been perfectly reasonable. But one could argue that sometimes they've been heavy-handed or lasted too long. So as an example, in the United Kingdom, congregations were not allowed to sing for more than a year, even though secular choirs could meet, rehearse, and even perform. This was very unfair. Animal welfare activists are arguing that the welfare of animals is more important than the sensitivities of Jews and Muslims. So there is quite a lot of pressure to outlaw the slaughter of animals according to kosher or halal rules. Now, as Christians, we should be concerned about animal welfare as well, but animals should not be more important than religious freedom. There's also pressure to ban boy circumcision. But that's a core belief, a core identity marker for Jews and Muslims. And if that was to be outlawed, this would be truly terrible. We really should be careful about this devaluing of religious freedom for all. There's an argument that just keep your faith private, keep it hidden, don't let it come into ordinary life. So there is the banning of religious symbols, clothing and symbols in the workplace, be that headscarves, kippahs, crosses. Employers say, well, we have a right to be neutral, but their neutral means enforced secularism. That's not neutral. And then conscientious objection at work has become limited. So according to the Council of Europe, there's a resolution that says healthcare workers should be able to opt out of things like abortion or euthanasia, as long as the patient is still able to get the service that they wish and that is legal in their nation. But in Sweden, midwives now have to perform abortions. There have also been lots of cases where there have been dismissals or disciplinary hearings for people who've prayed at work or sought to share their faith at work. I'd like to ask, why can't there be reasonable accommodation? That's when the person who has got a faith and the employer work something out so that the faith issue can be sorted out and resolved, but still the employer gets the job done, the employee contributes well to the team, the customer gets the service. Compromise very often would be possible, but too often the effort is not made. We also see the banning of hate speech. And very often this is to do with people who want to express more conservative beliefs on LGBTQ issues and gender. So biblical views, but other faiths would be included as well. Street preachers have been arrested. People have been have lost their jobs for expressing these views, or they've had their jobs, yet their speaking opportunities cancelled because they're saying things that others think are offensive. Hate speech legislation is spreading, and the European Union is preparing legislation which may go through the legislative process next year. The problem is, what's the definition of hate speech? When people define it as anything that someone finds offensive or anything that goes against Western views on sexuality and gender, then we have a problem and we have a major limiting of free speech and freedom of religion. There's a photograph here of Päivi Räisänen, who is a member of parliament in Finland. She published a tweet of a Bible verse, a pamphlet, and also she gave a radio interview giving biblical views on sexuality in a perfectly reasonable way. But she's on trial. The court case will be happening beginning in January for these views, which supposedly are hate speech. But by the way, if we are wanting to see freedom of speech preserved, then we need to look at blasphemy laws. In many nations, blasphemy laws still exist, and blasphemy laws limit free speech. So if we want free speech for ourselves, we can't really be supporting blasphemy laws. There are other issues to do with LGBTQ plus sensitivities and relationships. So increasingly in schools, our sex and relationship education gives very liberal ideas, and teachers and pupils who are not comfortable cannot opt out. Parents, supposedly, according to human rights legislation, have the right to have their children educated according to their beliefs. But if they question this kind of education, very often they don't get very far. And then in many nations, there are, or there may soon be, conversion therapy bans. A conversion therapy is when someone seeks to suppress or change the same-sex attraction that an individual has. The motivation for these bans are the horror stories of torture and terrible abuse that has occasionally happened. But the trouble is that these bans can be defined very vaguely, and they can include core religious practice. So they can outlaw the chance for us to define what sin is. They can outlaw the opportunity to pray, to preach, to give counsel to those who want it. And what if you are the person with same-sex attraction and you want people to pray for you? You want counsel and support. So these bans would prevent you from receiving the support that you want. And then there are issues to do with what I would call national values and also understandable fear of terrorism. There have been many terrorist atrocities, and it's right for our governments to work out what they can do to defend us. But that goes wrong when it's going to impinge on the freedom of religion or belief of everybody. So, for example, in France, there is this new anti-separatism law, and this brings in heavy bureaucratic rules on all faith communities, but also the authorities are going to be watching what's being preached in churches as well as in mosques. And if they think that what's being preached goes against Republican values, they could step in. Well, what are Republican values? If you preach perhaps biblical views on sexuality, does that go against Republican values? And then in many parts of France, Spain, Italy, maybe elsewhere, it's increasingly hard to open a new mosque and also a new church. So just as one example, in Lombardia in northern Italy, the Ponte Luce Evangelical Church has been through a very expensive and exhausting legal marathon in order to have the right to meet. Finally, I would like to just mention the injustice that there is towards many asylum seekers who are seeking to be able to stay in Europe as refugees. There is the unjust assessment of the actual conversion of Christian asylum seekers. Are they really Christian? Are they just pretending to be Christian in order to stay? But the interview process is really unfair. And then in that interview process, often the risk of persecution, if someone might be sent home, is dismissed. It's not taken seriously. So unfortunately, there have been many Christian brothers and sisters who have been deported back to very severe danger. So just a few concluding remarks. The definition of freedom or belief is being redefined. It's being redefined so that it's about not being, it's being limited so that you mustn't offend people. You can't be free to offend people. It's being limited so that you can't challenge LGBTQ rights or gender rights. Or it's only really freedom of religion or belief for the major faith or worldview of a particular nation. But that's not proper freedom of religion or belief for all. And also, nations are increasingly categorizing themselves as secular or Christian. But neither of those categories are correct. Every nation is plural. And of course, until Jesus comes back, no nation is properly Christian. But because we have these categories, we as Christians, we can be intimidated by secularism, or we can be beguiled and think everything's wonderful if we're in a supposedly Christian nation. But actually our religious freedom and the freedom of others can be in severe danger in a so-called secular or Christian nation. So let's find ways to be vigilant in prayer and in advocacy for freedom of religion or belief for all. And let's have a positive vision, being able to explain that this is a vital value for everybody. Thanks, everyone.
What a pleasure to be with you in Poland, although I only wish we were together in person and not virtually. By now, you should have heard my friend and colleague Julia's talk. For me, it was a picture of Europe drifting from its faith and its roots and muddled in its principles and its practices, which underscores the need for all of us as followers of Jesus to be champions of freedom and justice, and what we're talking about today, which is religious freedom. The issue before the world is, how do we live with our deepest differences, and the deepest ones are religious? How do we live with our deepest differences in a world of exploding pluralism? And how do we bring in freedom and justice for everybody? Now, often when things are really wrong, people naturally say, why? But as the greatest thinkers have always pointed out, the real question should be not just why, but why not? And we as followers of Jesus should be visionaries, always working not only against injustices and contradictions at some local level, but showing humankind and Europe towards a better way of justice. Now, I can't possibly talk about religious freedom well and adequately in 15 minutes. But let me give you some of the headlines. First, why is it urgent today? The basic reason is the explosion of pluralism. Travel, media, scholarship, and many other things have highlighted the fact that, as it's put in the social sciences, today, everyone is now everywhere. And we've got to negotiate how we live with those differences. Secondly, though, that means that many of our traditional settlements, the arrangements for how we've lived historically with religion and religious differences, have broken down. And so we've got to forge new ways to go forward. And the third reason is the growing sense of a virtual public square. The idea of the public square goes back, of course, to our Greek friends and the agora in Athens. It was physical. In England, Westminster. In France, the Assemblée, and so on, a physical place. That, of course, became metaphorical. And people talked about the op-ed pages of a newspaper or a television show as being the public square, and that was right. But now, in the day of the internet and with social media, the public square has gone virtual. And you can see in the responses, say, to Salman Rushdie's satanic verses or the Pope's speech at Regensburg and so on. We have to figure out how to live with our differences when those differences in the virtual age often become explosive and sometimes violent. So this is an urgent issue. Secondly, why is it foundational? Religious freedom, freedom of conscience, along with freedom of speech and freedom of assembly or association, are the three political rights. There's no hierarchy, but they're all interlocking. Clearly, freedom of assembly assumes and requires good freedom of speech. But equally, freedom of speech assumes and requires a good understanding of freedom of conscience. You're free to speak about anything, the weather, for example. But the freedom should touch the deepest things, those things which we believe and we cannot but believe based on our conscience. The second reason it's important is the idea of a civil society. Societies are healthy if between ordinary citizens and the government to the top, there is a thick layering of intermediate associations, families and voluntary organizations and so on, in which we can volunteer, give our time and do all sorts of things. Civil society. And of course, religious freedom is critical to civil societies because it's those things we choose based on our faith that we give to, volunteer to, and pursue justice through, and so on. The third reason religious freedom is important is social harmony. And that's a challenge. I was born in China and often go back to China. And a former president, Hu Jintao, often referred to China as the harmonious society. But I always say to my Chinese friends, even in China, that's no big deal. Because what they have extraordinary harmony, and they have extraordinary diversity. But they don't have the missing third element, which is the challenge, liberty. How do you have liberty with diversity and yet achieve harmony? That's only done when you have a proper ordering of religious freedom. Third question, why have things got worse in so much of the Western world in the last couple of decades? I call the answers the three dark R's, in English anyway. The first are the reducers, those who've reduced religious freedom to freedom of worship. Read Article 18 of the Universal Declaration. It covers coming to faith, practicing faith, changing faith, witnessing to faith, a comprehensive right, far more than freedom of worship. Every dictator worth his salt has granted freedom of worship to people so long as they keep their mouths shut and it stays between their two ears. That is not religious freedom. It matters that we have the free exercise and practice of religion, and the reducers are wrong. Religious freedom is much more than freedom of worship. The second R are the removers, those who would like to cleanse public life totally from all religion. Now, they were given a tremendous boost by 9/11 and the fear of some of the Islamic terrorists. And you can see people like the atheists, such as Richard Dawkins, who'd like to remove all religion from public life. But that, of course, is not religious freedom. The third one is the current danger, what I call the rebranders. Religious freedom used to be the first liberty. But now, in the light of the sexual revolution, it's described as a code word for discrimination, for bigotry, for hatred. And they have rebranded a freedom as something extremely ugly. They're wrong, but we need to answer them strongly. A fourth and very crucial question: which model, which arrangement is best to have religion in public life? There are basically three options. One, and I don't agree with this, it's what's called the sacred public square, where some religion or another is the official formal religion of a nation. Now, obviously, that's wonderful for those who believe that religion, but everybody else is second class, or maybe worse, persecuted. And that does not give religious freedom for everyone. The second option is the other extreme, what's called the naked public square, where all religion is removed antiseptically, although, of course, often secularism is smuggled in the back door. Now, the problem with that, again, is not just and free for everyone. Most of the world, not everyone, but most of the world is religious. So probably 80% or more of the world are cut out when you insist on a naked public square. The third option, and the one I would argue for strongly, although it takes much more time, is what's called the civil public square, where everyone, based on their freedom of conscience, is free to enter and engage the public square on the basis of their faith. Now, that means, of course, all sorts of things have to be added as assumptions. It assumes, for example, that we persuade and we don't coerce, and all sorts of things like that. A civil public square is not being nice. The differences make a difference, and they matter. A civil public square is not a bad form of ecumenism. We're agreeing that everyone's ideas are right. No. Religious freedom means the right to believe anything. But it doesn't mean that anything anyone believes is right. It means we engage other positions, other faiths, and other policies that grow out of it with civility, with persuasion, and not with coercion. But of course, we recognize in democracy, the voice of the 51% often prevails. We've got to make sure that our voices as Christians are heard too, and that they are powerful and persuasive, both in what we say and in the way we live behind what we say. Now, in wrapping this up, I've got to say, we have to enter the debate humbly, because while we as followers of Jesus were the pioneers of religious freedom, the first argument for it was Tertullian in the 2nd century, and the second was Lactantius, the tutor to the Emperor Constantine's son, just a few years later. So we were the pioneers of religious freedom. And following the Reformation, voices such as Roger Williams were the pioneers of the modern understanding of freedom of conscience and religious freedom. But while we can truly stand, and especially those of us who are evangelicals, as the pioneers of religious freedom, we have to say humbly, the parts of the church have been the perpetrators of the worst violations against religious freedom. Take the Inquisition, or the notion that error has no rights. And of course, today we understand that we are the most persecuted faith in the world. But thank God that the Lord who told Moses to say, "Let my people go," is the God of freedom and justice. He frees his people not only to worship him freely, but to know how to live together freely with each other. So in our world today, we as followers of Jesus should be the great champions and the great defenders of freedom, of justice, and freedom of conscience and religious freedom. Next year, in June 2022, will be the 10th anniversary of the Global Conscience of Freedom, put forward by at the European Parliament in June 2012. Let's not only stand against the injustices and the violations today, which we must, but let's also explore ways how we can point the whole world forward to freedom and justice for everyone in the light of our great biblical principles. What a day to be a follower of Jesus. The Lord be with you all. Thank you.